Okay, there's that. Here we are on YouTube. There's the chat list. Okay, so for those of you who will be listening on YouTube at some point, let me welcome you. We're continuing our project of reading a story from Elizabeth Bowen and then a story from James Joyce from the Dubliners, and then we'll discuss them. So that's it. And we're starting with the Elizabeth Bowen story, A Walk in the Woods. All right, here we go. The mysterious thing was that the woods were full of people, though they showed a front of frondy depth and silence, inviolate and sifted through with sun. They looked like a whole element, like water, possible to behold, but not to enter, in which only the native creature can exist. But this was a deception. Once inside them, it was only at a few moments that the solitary walker could feel himself alone. And lovers found it hard to snatch unregarded kisses. For those few moments when nobody was in sight, the glades of bronze bracken, the wet green rides leading off, still seemed to be the edge of another world. The brown distances, the deep hollows welled with magic, forlorn silence, as though they were untrodden. But what was likely to be the last fine Sunday of autumn had brought Londoners, or people from the suburbs on this side of the city, in hundreds into these woods, which lay open. The people's property, crisscrossed by tarmac roads on which yellow leaves stuck. Next, please.
People who came here were mostly well-to-do, for you needed a car to get here without effort. So saloon cars run off the roads between the wide apart birch trees were packed flank to flank, like shining square-rumped tin pigs, in the nearby glades. Inside a few of these cars, people remained sitting with the wireless on, but mostly they had got out, yawned, stretched, and scattered in trees and fours. Most of the Londoners lacked a sense of direction. Directly they were out of the sight of the road, and a atavistic fear of the woods invaded them. Willing or unwilling, they walked in circles, coming back again and again to make certain they had not lost their cars, in which had often been left a tea basket, an overcoat of some value, or an old lady, an aunt or a grandmother. Not to be sure where one is induces panic, and yet the sensation of being lost was what they unconsciously looked for on this holiday. They had come to the woods. The sound of older people whistling to dogs, of macintoshes rustling against the bracken, reassured them and made them strike in deeper. Next, please.
Walking between the pillars of the trees, the men squared their shoulders, as though they inherited savage dignity. The matronly women, heavy in fur coats, which just taken out after the summer, shed a smell of camphor, protestingly rolled as they walked on their smart heels. They looked about them dissatisfied, acquisitive, despising the woods because they belonged to everyone. Had they not profoundly dreaded a trespass, they would have preferred the property of some duke. Now and then, recalling a pottery vase at home, they would strip off their gloves and reach for a fan-like spray of gold beech leaves. Or, unwillingly stooping, they tugged at a frond of bracken, but that was hard to pick. Their faces stayed unrelaxed. There was no poetry for the middle-class woman in her middle years. Nature's disturbing music is silent for her. Her short phase of instinctive life is over. She is raising, forcing upwards the children she has and driving her man on. Her features become bleak with narrow intention. She is riveted into society. Still, to touch the edge of nature stands for an outing. You pack baskets and throng to the edge of forest or sea. The still, damp, glittering woods, the majestic death of the year, were reflected in the opaque eyes of these women, hardly more human, very much less pathetic than the glass eyes of the foxes some of them wore. In family parties, the women and men parted. They did not speak to each other. The women walked more slowly to act as a break. Where tracks narrowed between thickets or bracken, the families went in files. The children escaped and kept chasing each other, catcalling round the trees. They were not allowed to run down the wet green rides. Next, please.
Sometimes the thud of hooves was heard, and young people on horseback crossed the end of the glade in colored jerseys with chins up, flaunting their bold happiness. The walkers, with a sort of animal envy, lowered their eyes and would not look after them. From couples of lovers crashing through the bracken or standing suspended in love, fingers touching and patches of sun, eyes were averted in a commenting way. The riders thudding across the glade were heard, not seen, by a couple in a thicket. These two, in a secret clearing at the foot of the oak, sat on a mackintosh eating sandwiches. They were very hungry. They had come to the edge of the woods in a green line bus, struck in and wandered for a long time now, looking for the place their fancy wanted. The woman, a city woman, refused to believe the woods had no undiscovered heart, if one could only come on it. Each time she had sighted the black of another tarmac road, she had let out a persecuted sigh. The young man saw she was flagging and he was hungry. He had found what she wanted by fighting through the thicket to the foot of the oak, then pulling her after him. And there they at least saw no one. They had spread the mackintosh, kissed, and opened the sandwiches. Next, please. Anne?
Okay. Listen, she said, there go people riding. Did you ever ride? I did once. On that farm? Yes, that time, she said, smiling quickly, touched that he should remember. She spoke often about her childhood, never about her girlhood, which was past, for she was 10 years older than he, and her girlhood had been brief. She had married young. She watched him reach out for another sandwich, then gently and willfully detained him by making her thumb and finger into a bracelet around his thin wrist. He pulled his wrist up to his lips and kissed the joint of her thumb. They enjoyed this play as seriously as lions. She shut her eyes, dropped her head back to let the sun through the branches fall on her forehead, then let his wrist go. He took the sandwich he wanted. She opened her eyes and saw him. You greedy boy. Yes, I am greedy, he said. You know I'm greedy. She thrust both hands up her cheeks and said, that's no good here. No, we've struck unlucky. I thought woods in winter. It's still autumn. It's the fine Sunday. Her face went narrow as though she heard the crack of a whip. She opened the gap in their thicket by bending a branch back. With cautious, angry eyes, they both looked through. A party of 5 people were filing through the bracken about 10 yards away. There they go, she said. There go the neighbors. That's my life. Oh, God, Henry. Next. Next.
Oh,
I don't have the book.
Yeah,
Anne.
it'll be Duncan. Yeah, I know. It'll be Duncan.
Okay. They can't hurt us. You know they can. Now, look, eat that last sandwich, do. What about you? I don't want it. I cut them for you. Turkey and ham, that should be. I'm a spoiled boy, said Henry, taking the sandwich without any more fuss. She crumpled up the paper, drove it with the point of his stick into the soft earth at the foot of the oak, and earthed it up alive. Then she brushed crumbs from the mackintosh with a downcast face, making a bed in which they dare not lie. But Henry threw his long legs up, scrambled round like a dog, lay across the mackintosh with his head in Carlotta's lap. She stroked his stubborn dark hair back, leaned her bosom over his face, and stroked his forehead with a terrible held-in tenderness. The whole weight of his body seemed to have gone to his head, which lay as heavy as the world on her thighs. His clerk's face was exposed to her touch and to the sky, generally so intent, overexpressive, nervous. The face was wiped into blank repose by her touch. He flung one hand across his chest and held a fold of her skirt. His spectacles, by reflecting the sky's light, hid his eyes from her. So she leaned over further and lifted them off gently. She looked into the blotted darkness of his pupils, which from being exposed like this, looked naked. Then he shut his eyes and put on the withdrawn smile of someone expecting sleep. You are so good, he said. Sleep then. Go on, sleep. Will you? Maybe. Sleep. Next, please.
But she watched with the bend of her spine against the tree, while he lay with his eyes shut. She saw that his will to sleep was a gentle way of leaving her for a little. She felt a tide of peace coming in, but then the tide turned. His forehead twitched. A bird trilled its unhopeful autumn song. He opened his eyes and said, "It's awful having no place. But we make a place of our own. But I get so tired. All this doesn't seem natural. Oh, Henry, what's the good?" Well, you've often said that. Then you said, "What's the good?" It was all very fine at first, he said, just knowing you, just coming round to your place, seeing you before Joe got back, or even with Joe. I used to like to have a place of my own. That was why I'd rather go with you than a girl. That's why you want, that's what you want, she said, just mothering. That's what Joe thinks. He doesn't think any harm. Here comes your boy, he says. I think he's right too. That's all you're really after. She gently outlined his mouth with one of her fingertips. Next, please.
But his mouth tightened. No, it's more than that now, he said. You know it's more than that. He stared at the sky with his unfocused eyes, like a hare's eyes. I wanted what I've got. I wanted that all the time. I wanted that from the first. Though it may once have been mixed up in the other thing, but ever since that, ever since we... Do you wish we hadn't? You don't know what you're saying, but I used to like your home. It was such a snug little place. I was happy there in a way. That's all gone now. I used to like Joe too one time, and now it's awful. This isn't what I imagined the first time I saw you, hiding in woods like this. It isn't fit for you, really. It's my only life. You're my only life, my only way out. Before you came, I was walled in alive. I didn't know where to turn. I was burning myself out. I don't mind where we go so long as we get away from them. And we do have these days when Joe's gone to his mother's. But we've got no place. When I was young, I used to believe there was really some tremendous world, and that one would get it, a sort of Shakespeare world. And I heard it in music too, and I lived there for 3 days after I first met you. I once used to believe, but you're young still. Well, perhaps I do still. I always have. That's our place. But we ought to have some real place. I mean, I want you. Oh, shut up, she said. Look, come on, he said, getting up. Better walk on. This does no good. Let's walk on into the woods. Next, please.
They're so full, but they look empty. Kiss once. They kissed. It was he who pulled apart. He gathered up her mackintosh on his arm and began to fight a way out for her through the thickets. As she stepped between the branches, he held back. Her lips shook and she looked quite blind. Her look attracted the notice of Muffet and Isabella, 2 schoolgirls who, walking arm in arm through the woods, had already started to stare and nudge each other on seeing the thicket of purple leaves shake. Any man and woman together made them giggle. They saw a haggard woman with dark red hair and a white face. Something in her expression set them off giggling all the more. Henry disentangled the mackintosh from the last of the thicket. His consciousness of the girls staring and giggling made him look very young. His pride in Carlotta was wounded. His pity for her abased him. She was a married woman out with her neighbor's lodger. They both came from a newly developed suburb and had met at the local debating society. Next, please.
As he saw the girls' pink faces stuck open with laughter, he saw why Carlotta hated her life. He saw why she towered like a statue out of place. She was like something wrecked and cast up on the wrong shore. When they met, she had been one of those women going through life dutifully and at the same time burning themselves up. Across the hall where they met, her forehead like no other woman's forehead, her impatient carriage, her deep eyes and held-in mouth had been like a signal to him. He could not turn away. When they had talked, she excited, released, soothed him. Pride and a bitter feeling of misdirection had, up to that meeting, isolated them both. Passion broke down a wall in each of their lives, but her spirit was stronger than his, and so he was frightened of her. Carlotta stumbled, stepping out of the thicket, and put a hand on his elbow for support. Henry twitched his elbow away and strode ahead of her, lashing round at the bracken with his stick. Henry, look out. They're looking. Those girls behind. Don't look round. All right, she said. We can't be too careful, can we? Henry did not know if she spoke in irony or sheer pain. Next.
Muffet was spending the Sunday with Isabella. His family lived not far from the Green Line bus stop. The girls were friends at the high school. They both wore dark blue overcoats and walked bareheaded. Their lively faces showed no particular character. They were allowed by their mothers to walk in the woods so long as they did not get talking to men. They had been told what happens to girls who do that. Their minds were bulging with cautionary horrors. They had neither of them got boys yet. When they had got boys, they would stop walking together. At present, their walks were gay and enjoyable. On fine Sundays, the woods were a great show for them. Too soon, this would be over. Winter's silence would fall. This afternoon, in a fairly retired glade, they had come on a lonely car in which a couple embraced. They also inspected cars parked near the roadside, squinting in at grandmothers and the picnic baskets, running away in alarm from pairs of well-got-up women, upright in the backs of cars like idols under glass cases, discontentedly waiting for their men to return. Or, intercepting a bar of wireless music, Isabel and Muffet would take a few dancing steps. They envied the thundering riders, the young lovers, the imperious owners of well-bred dogs. Next, please.
Isabella and Muffet, anything but reluctant, hopped with impatience where brook and river met. They were 15. They stared at everyone. At the same time, they had a sense of propriety which was very easily offended. They peered at the broken thicket, then turned to stare after the couple. My goodness, said Isabella, she looked silly. Breaking trees too, said Muffet, that's against the law. Besides being old enough to be his mother. She was old. Did you see her? Perhaps she was his mother. Mother, my eye. But he gave her the push all right. Did you see that? Did you see? Going on at him like that. Well, I call it a shame. It's a shame on him. He's a nice boy. No, I call him sappy. I mean, at her age, fancy him letting her. Well, I tell you, I call it a shame. Well, I tell you, it makes me laugh. Look, let's go down there. I see people down there. Isabella dug a bag of sweets out of her pocket and they sauntered on, both sucking, talking, and cheeks blocked. Supposing you got offered a fur coat, what kind would you go for? Nutria or Kolinsky? If a boy that always went racing, but that you were sweet on, asked you to marry him, would you? Supposing you were going with a boy and then found out he was a truck murderer. Oh, there's such a sweet dog, such a sweet fella. Come then. My goodness, said Annabella, it isn't half getting dark. Well, what do you expect? No, but the sun's gone in. And that's not mist now. That's fog, that is. They are starting two of those cars up. Mother will be starting to worry and better be getting home. Next, please.
Yes, the mist that had been the natural breath of the woods was thickening to fog, as though the not distant city had sent out an infection. At dusk, coming so suddenly and so early, the people felt a touch of animal fear, quickening their steps. They closed on each other in a disordered way, as though their instinct were to bolt underground. Wind or thunder, though more terrible in woods, do not hold the same threat of dissolution. The people packed back into their cars. The cars lurched onto the roads and started back to London in the solid stream. Down the rides, beginning to be deserted, the trees with their leaves still clinging looked despoiled and tattered. All day the woods had worn a heroic, dying smile. Now they were left alone to face death. But this was still somebody's moment. There was still some daylight. The small lake or big pool clearly reflected in its black mirror the birches and reeds. A tall girl with a not quite young porcelain face, folding her black fur collar round her throat with both hands, stood posing against a birch, having her photograph taken across the water by two young men at the other side of the lake. Bob, busy over the camera on a portable tripod, was an art photographer. He could photograph nature in the most difficult light. Therefore, he could go far in search of her strange moods. He felt, thought, loved even, in terms of the lens. He sold his work to papers, where it appeared with lines of poetry underneath. This girl over the water in the fog-smudged woods was to be called Autumn Evening. Cecil, an old friend behind Bob's shoulder, looked across at the girl. Without breaking her pose, a born model's, she coughed and shook under her fur coat. Cecil said cautiously, "She's getting a bit cold, Bob." "Shh," said Bob sharply. He had become his camera. His whole temperament crouched over his subject like a lion over a bit of meat. "Won't be long," Cecil called across the lake. "I'm all right," said the girl, coughing again. "Tell her not to grab her collar up," Bob muttered. "She's not supposed to look cold. She's got her coat all dragged up. It spoils the figure." "He says not to grab your collar," Cecil shouted. Next, please.
Righto. She let her collar fall open, turning her head inside the fur corolla. She looked more obliquely across the lake. "Is that better? Okay, ready." The slow exposure began. People taking photographs in this half-light, this dreamlight, made Carlotta and Henry stop to wonder. They stood back among the birches to be out of the way. Then the artistic tensity broke up. Signals were exchanged across the water. The girl came round the lake to join the two young men. "What's that floating?" she said. But they were busy packing up the camera. "Should that be all right?" she said, but no one answered. Bob handed Cecil the tripod, shouldered his camera, and they walked away from the lake with Bob's hand on his girl's shoulder. "Do you think that photo will ever come out?" said Carlotta. "I suppose he knows what he's doing. I'd like to try with a camera." "I'd sooner paint," said Carlotta. They walked round the edge of the lake, looking across to where the girl had stood. She was pretty. Carlotta said she thought, "She'll get her death. But I'd like to stand like that. I wish Henry had a camera. I wish I could give him one." Against the photographer's shoulder blade, eternalized minutes were being carried away. Carlotta and Henry were both tired. What they saw seemed to belong in the past already. The light seemed to fade because of their own nerves, and still water in woods, in any part of the world, continues an everlasting, terrible fairy tale in which you are always lost, in which giants oppress. Now the people had gone. The lovers saw that this place was what they had been looking for all day, but they were so tired. Each stood in an isolated dream. Next, please.
"What is that floating?" she said. Henry screwed up his eyes. "A thermos." He picked up a broken branch and with an infinity of trouble started to claw in with the tip of the branch the floating flask towards himself. its cap was gone. But we don't want it, Henry. She might never have spoken. Henry's face was intent. He recklessly stood with one toe in the water, the ribbed aluminum cylinder twirling under the touches of the branch, rode reluctantly in. Henry reached it eagerly out of the water, shook it. It shattered inner glass coating, rattled about inside. The light hollowness, the feel of the ribs in his grasp made Henry smile with almost crazy pleasure. Treasure, he said, with a checked, excited laugh. Carlotta smiled, but she felt her throat tighten. She saw Henry's life curve off from hers, like one railway line from another, curve off to an utterly different and far off destination. When she trusted herself to speak, she said as gently as possible, "We'll have to be starting back soon. You know, it's some way, the bus." "No, we won't miss that," said Henry, rattling the flask and smiling.
Ooh.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay.
Yeah,
Oh
that's
my
quite a
goodness.
story. Yes.
She's
Yes.
not out, she's not out of the woods, huh? Oh
It's-
dear.
I don't know what to say about it, but it just moves you very much, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Uh,
I like the way that she introduces things, just kind of like one stroke at a time.
yeah.
Mhm.
And each time she introduces a new element, it kind of shifts all the other elements a little bit.
That yes, I mean, when you first meet Carlotta and Henry, it all seems so innocent and nice, and you don't realize the complications yet in their relationship.
Mhm.
And then it quickly you become aware the minute they mention that she's 10 years older.
Mhm.
It's kind
And
of
it's
a
the
signal.
two, yeah, and it's the two girls who make a comment on her age.
Yeah, and it strengthens that
Yeah.
feeling,
Mhm.
and it's how other people see them.
Yeah.
Yeah, but those two girls, at least my feeling was that those two girls you see, they're setting themselves up right with their actions for that same sort of alienation
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
in their later lives. That
They
they're
know.
they're already very judgmental and they're quick to frame things.
Mhm.
And you know, you can actually see that happening to them over time. Yeah, quite, this is quite different. You know, we, the last two sessions, we've read, I believe, an early story and then one of her mid stories, and this is a later story. And I think this is a very mature story.
Yeah. And what do you think? What do you think is the ending?
I think that I think it's a point at which Carlotta really realizes that this is going to end real soon.
It seems ominous to me
Yeah.
that he has broken glass like he could hurt her.
That didn't
Yeah, I don't get that myself.
you thought that too?
No, not at all. He was
Except he
really,
was.
he was really showing himself as the still essentially boy that he is.
Yeah. And he was going to hurt her eventually, he would leave.
Well, I think she knows that.
Yeah.
She knows that already. She's not,
Right.
she,
Yeah.
she she's not very expectant. I think that she's the one who's actually enjoying uh kind of what they have. She's really not expecting beyond that.
Well, she's kind of the giver and he's the taker.
He's just naive. But I mean, this is true of everybody in the story.
Yeah.
I mean, you got the girls, then you got the photography thing. You know, this is probably very pretentious for me to say it, but I'm going to say it anyway. This reminds me a lot of Cubism.
Mhm.
In what way? In what way?
That Elizabeth Bowen with very simple strokes, like if you think about Duchamp's thing, Nude Descending the Stairs, where
Yeah.
you have these very simple, almost stick figures
Yeah.
sort of thing. This is almost like a cubistic treatment of kind of normal modern life. And that whole thing about people going to the woods, and but they wanted to go to the woods because it was nature and all that, but they were actually scared of it and they were worried about getting lost. I mean, it's really brilliant in some
You,
ways.
you, your own experiences seem to find their way into the story too.
Mhm.
Um,
I'm laughing about just the mention of the Macintosh, because earlier today I was with an Irish lady came over from London. We went to Glasnevin, and I wore my Macintosh, and we
Oh,
went for coffee. We were talking about just one of the things that I just the one of the mysteries. Who's the man in the lanky
in the
looking Galatian
Macintosh.
and the number 13? So yeah, so it's kind of interesting to see just a Macintosh come up today.
There you go.
There you go.
So did
Oh,
you wear the Macintosh deliberately because you were going to Glasnevin, or it just happened to be?
Oh, I did. No, I know how to. I did wear deliberately. Yeah, yeah. Funny.
Yeah.
But what else was I going to say?
like
Well,
that
what
story.
do you think? Well, what do you think of the thermos with the broken glass?
I think it's just a thermos with broken glass.
She's too complex for just a simple. It's because the sentences are. Well, she says we'll have to be getting back soon. It's some way, and the bus. So they have to be on time for the bus. And he
Mhm.
says, no, we won't miss that. That means that they don't need the bus, or they'll be on the bus.
No, there'll be
And he
other.
says it rattling the flask and smiling. To me, it's a symbol that it's a broken relationship at best. It can't go to the level that he wants, which is companionship in a home. And she's married, and I think the relationship is over for him, and that's what the broken flask symbolizes.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, that's an idea. I mean,
Huh.
he's asserting himself at
Yeah.
that point,
Yes.
that he's not listening to what she says.
Yeah, he's become convinced, maybe.
Yeah, I'm gonna stick with it. It's a thermos with a broken thermos, and it's just a sign that he at least for the moment has turned his attention away from her, and he's taking delight in some other aspect of the world, if you like, some other broken aspect of the world. But I don't think it's necessarily over. I just don't think it really has any. It's never had anywhere to go but what it is.
What was the point
And
of
she saw
the
Henry's. Sorry, Anne.
nothing? Sorry. What was the point of the whole story about the model and the photographer, and what has that got to do with anything?
I think with that, they're looking at a young woman who is confident, has her coat open, it's photographic, is attractive, and here Carlotta has been described as too old for the man she's with.
Okay.
It's,
Huh. Okay, well, yeah, anybody else have an interpretation of that?
I go along with that really. But because just before the girls have remarked how old she looks, I mean,
Mhm.
obviously it must be, she isn't 10 years older looking like a younger woman. You know,
Yeah.
somebody 10 years older can look younger.
I just saw a line there, and it's probably what made him think about it more. It says, as he saw the girls' pink faces stuck open with laughter, he saw why Caroletta hated her life. He saw why she towered like a statue out of place.
yeah.
He's beginning to realize now. She's like something wrecked and cast up on the wrong shore.
Yeah.
Broken.
And she was a little desperate.
Well, he's a little desperate too.
Mhm. There's just a
But he's okay.
sadness. Every incident that's told is just another level of sadness and decline and the impact of aging and
And the time of
Impossible.
year, it's fall.
yeah, it's autumn. Autumn.
Mhm. Well, and
Mhm.
I think that my interpretation of the photographer thing is the photographer represents people trying to take this weird world that we live in and make it into an art piece or an advertisement. Even though we know the girl's actually cold. But, you know, she's a professional model. Professional models know that, you know, you do what you can to keep yourself comfortable. But if they tell you to, you know, pretend that it's not cold, then you pretend it's not cold long enough for them to get the shot.
I was kind of thinking just modern society now and how everything's on Instagram and you can't just experience it, but you have to kind of photograph it, you know. So in here, okay, they're trying. He's an art photographer, but it's not just a day out day in the woods, you know. It's a photo shoot, you know. So
Yeah, it's a photo shoot. It's a you know, I'm a crank. Self-admitted crank here. I hate post photos. I absolutely despise them. And,
What?
and
Hey,
I,
what?
I hate posed photos.
Post photos.
So like I haven't done it in 3 years because I'm not gonna I want to take a chance with COVID, but I'm a social dancer. I love to go dancing. And I attended lots and lots of dances, but the part of it that I hated was where you had, and I just refused to do this, where you had to pretend that this was the perfect moment in your dancing life. And you would pose, or they would have contests of dancers competing with each other, and they would all, you know, and I'm just here. I'm just like, you know, life is up, down, all around. You know, it's okay. We don't have to pretend that it's perfect. We don't have to be happy at any particular time. I think all of us experience happiness now and again, and maybe multiple times a day. But the modern tendency to either make things all wonderful or all terrible, you know, is I think, you know, she's doing a good job of displaying that here.
I like your idea of, you know, that the photograph is the fixed image and it's posed and controlled. I also see it like Carlotta would never be again in a picture like that.
Okay.
And they couldn't be photographed either.
Yeah.
Couldn't be
Yeah.
photographed.
And I saw another line here, sorry, but her spirit was stronger than his, and so he was frightened of her.
Mm-hmm.
And when she stumbled, he didn't help.
Yeah. and he cast her off. He brushed her off when they came out of the woods.
Right. Of course, they would justify that as they didn't want people to know that there was anything
Yeah.
between them. So it's all right. Anyway, I think this is a much more mature story than the last two
Oh,
stories.
yeah.
Very good story.
And I really enjoyed reading this story.
Yeah.
And
I
would
did
like to
too.
would like to read more of hers that is
On
this
this
level.
well
The
developed.
latter, the latter stories.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's
Yeah.
we go, particularly because we're doing the comparison with Joyce. And the other two stories, which were her earlier stories, compared to a Dubliner story, it's
Yeah.
just a comparison. So
So what's the timeline of all these stories? Like, is there like, when did she write them all? Or were they different periods of her life, or do you know?
yeah, let's see when that one was. This was in what page were we on?
488. It's the 30s. This section is
Okay.
called the 30s.
Actually, this is not so far from from her table spread, which is nowhere near as good a story as this,
Oh, no.
in my humble opinion. And
Oh, I think this is the best one we've read.
Yeah, this was good. Yeah, but we've got post-war. Let's kind of think about no earlier than A Walk in the Woods, and maybe the war years and post-war years.
Yeah.
Oh, then I can turn my library book in.
Yeah.
There you go. You can turn your library book in. And it will be interesting to see if she keeps up this level of skill in the later stories, which I have no idea.
Mm.
All right. Anyway, shall we pick a story from Dubliners?
How about a little cloud?
A little cloud.
Mhm.
Oh, Susan, I love your dog.
This is Harvey.
Oh,
Been away.
Oh,
He's
there's a nice dog.
me. So yeah. All right, Harvey.
That's
Okay.
cute.
Let's see. I believe I just start with a little cloud, right? Right. Now we start. 8 years before, he had seen his friend off at the North Wall.
We're going to do a little cloud.
Here, I'm gonna go, Susan, I'm gonna put you on mute for the moment, so
Sorry, yeah.
that's okay. A little cloud, 8 years before, he had seen his friend off at the North Wall and wished him Godspeed. Gallagher had got on. You could tell that at once by his traveled air, his well-cut tweed suit, his fearless accent. Few fellows had talents like his, and fewer still could remain unspoiled by such success. Gallagher's heart was in the right place, and he had deserved to win. It was something to have a friend like that. Next, please.
Little Chandler's thoughts ever since lunchtime had been of his meeting with Gallagher, of Gallagher's invitation, and of the great city, London, where Gallagher lived. He was called Little Chandler because, though he was but slightly under the average stature, he gave one of the idea of being a little man. His hands were white and small, his frame was fragile, his voice was quiet, and his manners were refined. He took the greatest care of his fair silken hair and moustache, and used perfume discreetly on his handkerchief. The half moons of his nails were perfect, and when he smiled, you caught a glimpse of a row of childish white teeth. Next, please.
As he sat at his desk in the King's Inns, he thought what changes those 8 years had brought. The friend whom he had known under a shabby and necessitous guise had become a brilliant figure on the London press. He turned often from his tiresome writing to gaze out of the office window. The glow of a late autumn sunset covered the grass plots and walks. It cast a shower of kindly golden dust on the untidy nurses and decrepit old men who drowsed on the benches. It flickered upon all the moving figures, on the children who ran screaming along the gravel paths, and on everyone who passed through the gardens. He watched the scene and thought of life, and, as always happened when he thought of life, he became sad. A gentle melancholy took possession of him. He felt how useless it was to struggle against fortune, this being the burden of wisdom which the ages had bequeathed to him. Next, please.
He remembered the books of poetry upon his shelves at home. He had bought them in his bachelor days, and many an evening as he sat in the little room off the hall, he had been tempted to take one down from the bookshelf and read out something to his wife. But shyness had always held him back, and so the books had remained on their shelves. At times he repeated lines to himself, and this consoled him. When his hour had struck, he stood up and took leave of his desk, of his fellow clerks punctuously. Punctilly, I can't pronounce that. Whatever. He emerged from the feudal arch of the King's Inn, a neat, modest figure, and walked swiftly down Henrietta Street. The golden sunset was waning, and the air had grown sharp. Next, please.
A horde of grimy children populated the street. They stood or ran in the roadway or crawled up the steps before the gaping doors or squatted like mice upon the thresholds. Little Chandler gave them no thought. He picked his way deftly through all that minute vermin-like life, and under the shadow of the gaunt spectral mansions in which the old nobility of Dublin had roistered. No memory of the past touched him, for his mind was full of a present joy. He had never been in Corliss's, but he knew the value of the name. He knew that people went there after the theater to eat oysters and drink liqueurs, and he had heard that the waiters there spoke French and German. Walking swiftly by at night, he had seen cabs drawn up before the door and richly dressed ladies escorted by cavaliers alight and enter quickly. They wore noisy dresses and many wraps. Their faces were powdered, and they caught up their dresses when they touched earth, like alarmed Atlantises. He had always passed without turning his head to look. It was his habit to walk swiftly in the street, even by day, and whenever he found himself in the city late at night, he hurried on his way apprehensively and excitedly. Next.
Sometimes, however, he courted the causes of his fear. He chose the darkest and narrowest streets, and as he walked boldly forward, the silence that was spread about his footsteps troubled him. The wandering silent figures troubled him, and at times a sound of low, furtive laughter made him tremble like a leaf. Next, please.
Okay. He turned to the right towards Capel Street. Ignatius Gallagher on the London press. Who would have thought it possible 8 years before? Yikes, sorry about that. Still, now that he had reviewed the past, little Chandler could remember many signs of future greatness in his friend. People used to say that Ignatius Gallagher was wild. Of course, he did mix with a rakish set of fellows at the time, drank freely and borrowed money on all sides. In the end, he had got mixed up in some shady affair, some money transaction. At least that was one version of his flight. But nobody denied him talent. There was always a certain something in Ignatius Gallagher that impressed you, in spite of yourself. Even when he was at elbows and at his wits' end for money, he kept up a bold face. Little Chandler remembered, and the remembrance brought a slight flush of pride to his cheek. One of Ignatius Gallagher's sayings when he was in a tight corner. Half down now, boys, he used to say lightheartedly. Where's my considering cap? Next, please.
That was Ignatius Gallagher all out, and damn it, you couldn't but admire him for it. Little Chandler quickened his pace. For the first time in his life, he felt himself superior to the people he passed. For the first time, his soul revolted against the dull inelegance of Capel Street. There was no doubt about it. If you wanted to succeed, you had to go away. You could do nothing in Dublin. As he crossed Grattan Bridge, he looked down the river towards the lower quays and pitied the poor, stunted houses. They seemed to him a band of tramps huddled together along the river banks, their old coats covered with dust and soot. Stupefied by the panorama of sunset and waiting for the first chill of night to bid them arise, shake themselves and be gone. He wondered whether he could write a poem to express his idea. Perhaps Gallagher might be able to get into some London paper for him. Could he write something original? He was not sure what idea he wished to express, but the thought that a poetic moment had touched him took life within him like an infant hope. He stepped onwards bravely. Next, please.
Every step brought him nearer to London, farther from his own sober, inartistic life. A light began to tremble on the horizon of his mind. He was not so old, 32. His temperament might be said to be just at the point of maturity. There were so many different moods and impressions that he wished to express in verse. He felt them within him. He tried to weigh his soul to see if it was a poet's soul. Melancholy was the dominant note of his temperament, he thought. But it was a melancholy tempered by recurrences of faith and resignation and simple joy. If he could give expression to it in a book of poems, perhaps men would listen. He would never be popular, he saw that. He could not sway the crowd, but he might appeal to a little circle of kindred minds. The English critics perhaps would recognize him as one of the Celtic school by reason of the melancholy tone of his poems. Besides that, he would put in allusions. He began to invent sentences and phrases from the notice which his book would get. Mr. Chandler has the gift of easy and graceful verse. A wistful sadness pervades these poems, the Celtic note. It was a pity his name was not more Irish looking. Perhaps it would be better to insert his mother's name before the surname. Thomas Malone Chandler, or better still, T. Malone Chandler. He would speak to Gallagher about it. He pursued his reverie so ardently that he passed a street and had to turn back. As he came near Cordis's, his former agitation began to overmaster him, and he halted before the door in indecision. Finally, he opened the door and entered. Next, please.
We're reading sorry, I was just going to tell Katrina that we're reading A Little Cloud.
Yes.
So you know.
Thank you. Duncan told me, thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, Katrina, hi. The light and noise of the bar held him at the doorway for a few moments. He looked about him, but his sight was confused by the shining of many red and green wine glasses. The bar seemed to him to be full of people, and he felt that the people were observing him curiously. He glanced quickly to the right and left, frowning slightly to make his errand appear serious. When his sight cleared a little, he saw that nobody had turned to look at him, and there, sure enough, was Ignatius Gallagher, leaning with his back against the counter and his feet planted far apart. "Hello, Tommy, old hero. Here you are. What is it to be? What is it to be? What is it to be? What will you have? I'm taking whiskey. Better stuff than we get across the water. Soda, lithia, no, mineral. I'm the same. Spoils the flavor. Here, garçon, bring us 2 halves of malt whiskey like a good fellow." "Well, and how have you been pulling along since I saw you last? Dear God, how old we're getting. Do you see any signs of aging in me, eh? What? A little gray and thin on the top, what? Next, please."
Ignatius Gallagher took off his hat and displayed a large, closely cropped head. His face was heavy, pale, and clean-shaven. His eyes, which were of bluish slate color, relieved his unhealthy pallor and shone out plainly above the vivid orange he wore. Between these rival features, the lips appeared very long and shapeless and colorless. He bent his head and felt with two sympathetic fingers the thin hair at the crown. Little Chandler shook his head as a denial. Ignatius Gallagher put on his hat again. It pulls you down, he said. Press life. Always hurry and scurry, looking for copy and sometimes not finding it. And then always to have something new in your stuff. Damn proofs and printers. I say for a few days. I'm deuced glad, I can tell you, to get back to the old country. Does a fellow good, a bit of a holiday. I feel a ton better since I landed again in dear, dirty Dublin. Here you are, Tommy. Water? Say when. Next.
Little Chandler allowed his whiskey to be very much diluted. You don't know what's good for you, my boy, said Ignatius Gallagher. I drink mine neat. I drink mine little as a rule, little Chandler, said little Chandler modestly. An odd half one or so when I meet any of the old crowd. That's all. Ah, well, said Ignatius Gallagher cheerfully. Here's to us and to old times, an old acquaintance. They clinked glasses and drank the toast. I met some of the old gang today, said Ignatius Gallagher. O'Hara seems to be in a bad way. What's he doing? Nothing, said little Chandler. He's gone to the dogs. Next, please.
But Hogan has a good sit, hasn't he? Yes, he's in the Land Commission. I met him one night in London and he seemed to be very flush. Poor O'Hara. Booze, I suppose. Other things too, said little Chandler shortly. Ignatius Gallagher laughed. Tommy, he said, I see you haven't changed an atom. You're this very same serious person that used to lecture me on Sunday mornings when I had a sore head and a fur on my tongue. You want to knock about a bit in the world. You'd want to knock about a bit in the world. Have you never been anywhere, even for a trip? I've been to the Isle of Man, said little Chandler. Ignatius Gallagher laughed. The Isle of Man, he said. Go to London or Paris. Paris for choice. That'd do you good. Have you seen Paris? I think I have. I've knocked about there a little. And is it really so beautiful as they say? Asked little Chandler. He sipped a little of his drink while Ignatius Gallagher finished his boldly. Next, please.
Beautiful, said Ignatius Gallagher, pausing on the word and on the flavor of his drink. It's not so beautiful, you know. Of course, it is beautiful, but it's the life of Paris. That's the thing. There's no city like Paris for gaiety, movement, excitement. Little Chandler finished his whiskey and after some trouble succeeded in catching the bartender's eye. He ordered the same again. I've been to Moulin Rouge, Ignatius Gallagher continued when the barmen had removed their glasses, and I've been to all the bohemian cafes. Hot stuff. Not for a pious chap like you, Tommy. Little Chandler said nothing until the barman returned with 2 glasses. Then he touched his friend's glass lightly and reciprocated the former toast. He was beginning to feel somewhat disillusioned. Gallagher's accent and the way of expressing himself did not please him. There was something vulgar in his friend which he had not observed before. But perhaps it was only the result of living in London amidst the bustle and the competition of the press. The old personal charm was still there under this new gaudy manner. And after all, Gallagher had lived, he had seen the world. Little Chandler looked at his friend enviously. Next, please.
Everything in Paris is gay, said Ignatius Gallagher. They believe in enjoying life. And don't you think they're right? If you want to enjoy yourself properly, you must go to Paris. And mind you, they have a great feeling for the Irish there. When they heard I was from Ireland, they were ready to eat me, man. Little Chandler took four or five sips from his glass. Tell me, he said, is it true that Paris is so immoral as they say? Ignatius Gallagher made a Catholic gesture with his right arm. Every place is immoral, he said. Of course you do find spicy bits in Paris. Go to one of the students' balls, for instance. That's lively, if you like, when the coquettes begin to let themselves loose. You know what they are, I suppose. I've heard of them, said little Chandler. Ignatius Gallagher drank off his whiskey and shook his head. Next, please.
Ah, he said, you may say what you like. There's no woman like the Parisienne for style, for go. Then it is an immoral city, said little Chandler with timid insistence. I mean, compared with London or Dublin. London, said Ignatius Gallagher, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. You ask Hogan, my boy. I showed him a bit about London when he was over there. He'd open your eye, I'd say. Tommy, don't make punch of that whiskey. Liquor up. No, really. Oh, come on. Another one won't do you any harm. What is it? The same again, I suppose? Well, all right. Francois, the same again. Will you smoke, Tommy? Ignatius Gallagher produced a cigar case. The two friends lit their cigars and puffed at them in silence until the drinks were served. I'll tell you my opinion, said Ignatius Gallagher, emerging after some time from the clouds of smoke in which he had taken refuge. It's a rum world. Talk of immorality? I've heard of cases. What am I saying? I've known them. Cases of immorality. Next, please.
Ignatius Gallagher puffed thoughtfully at his cigar, and then, in a calm historian's tone, he proceeded to sketch for his friends some pictures of the corruption which was rife abroad. He summarized the vices of many capitals and seemed inclined to award the palm to Berlin. Some things he could not vouch for, his friends had told him, but of others he had had personal experience. He spared neither rank nor caste. He revealed many of the secrets of religious houses on the continent and described some of the practices which were fashionable in high society, and ended by telling with details a story about an English duchess, a story which he knew to be true. Little Chandler was astonished. Ah, well, said Ignatius Gallagher, here we are in old jog-along Dublin, where nothing is known of such things. How dull you must find it, said little Chandler, after all other places you've seen. Next, please.
Well, said Ignatius Gallagher, it's a relaxation to come over here, you know. And after all, it's the old country, as they say, isn't it? You can't help having a certain feeling for it. That's human nature. But tell me something about yourself. Hogan told me you had tasted the joys of connubial bliss. 2 years ago, wasn't it? Little Chandler blushed and smiled. Yes, he said, I was married last May, 12 months. I hope it's not too late in the day to offer you my best wishes, said Ignatius Gallagher. I didn't know your address, or I'd have done so at the time. He extended his hand, which little Chandler took. Well, Tommy, he said, I wish you and yours every joy in life, old chap, and tons of money, and may you never die till I shoot you. And that's the wish of a sincere friend, an old friend. You know that. I know that, said Chandler. Any youngsters? Said Ignatius Gallagher. Little Chandler blushed again. Well, we have one child, he said. Son or daughter? A little boy. Ignatius Gallagher slapped his friend sonorously on the back. Bravo, he said. I wouldn't doubt you, Tommy. Little Chandler smiled, looked confusedly at his glass, and bit his lower lip with 3 childishly white front teeth. I hope you'll spend an evening with us, he said, before you go back. My wife will be delighted to meet you. We can have a little music and... Thanks awfully, old chap, said Ignatius Gallagher. I'm sorry we didn't meet earlier, but I must leave tomorrow night. Next.
Tonight, perhaps. I'm awfully sorry, old man. You see, I'm over here with another fellow. Clever young chap he is, too. And we arranged to go to a little card party, only for that. Oh, yes, but who knows, said Ignatius Gallagher considerately. Next year, I may take a little skip over here. Now that I've broken the ice, it's only a pleasure deferred. Very well, said little Chandler. The next time you come, we must have an evening together. That's agreed now, isn't it? Yes, that's agreed, said Ignatius Gallagher. Next year, if I come, parole d'honneur. And to clinch the bargain, said little Chandler, we'll have just one more now. Ignatius Gallagher took out a large gold watch and looked at it. Is it to be the last, he said, because, you know, I have an AP. Oh, yes, positively, said little Gallagher. I'm sorry. Oh, yes, positively, said little Chandler. Very well then, said Ignatius Gallagher. Let's have another one. Adorius? That's a little good vernacular for a small whiskey, I believe. Next, please.
Little Chandler ordered the drinks. The blush which had risen to his face a few moments before was establishing itself. A trifle made him blush at any time, and now he felt warm and excited. 3 small whiskeys had gone to his head, and Gallagher's strong cigar had confused his mind, for he was a delicate and abstinent person. The adventure of meeting Gallagher after 8 years, of finding himself with Gallagher in coreless surroundings by lights and noise, of listening to Gallagher's stories, and of sharing for a brief space Gallagher's vagrant and triumphant life upset the equipoise of his sensitive nature. He felt acutely the contrast between his own life and his friends, and it seemed to him unjust. Gallagher was his inferior in birth and education. He was sure he could do something better than his friend had ever done or could ever do, something higher than mere tawdry journalism if he only got the chance. What was it that stood in his way? His unfortunate timidity. He wished to vindicate himself in some way, to assert his manhood. He saw behind Gallagher's refusal of his invitation. Gallagher was only patronizing him by his friendliness, just as he was patronizing Ireland by his visit. The barman brought out their drinks. Little Chandler pushed one glass towards his friend and took up the other boldly. Next, please.
Who knows, he said, as they lifted their glasses. When you come next year, I may have the pleasure of wishing long life and happiness to Mr. and Mrs. Ignatius Gallagher. Ignatius Gallagher, in the act of drinking, closed one eye expressively over the rim of his glass. When he had drunk, he smacked his lips decisively, setting down his glass, and said, "No blooming fear of that, my boy. I'm going to have my fling first and see a bit of life and the world before I put my head in the sack, if I ever do." "Someday you will," said little Chandler calmly. Ignatius Gallagher turned his orange tie and slate blue eyes full upon his friend. "You think so?" he said. "You'll put your head in the sack," repeated little Chandler stoutly, "like everyone else, if you can find the girl." He had slightly emphasized his tone, and he was aware that he had betrayed himself. But through the color had heightened in his cheek, he did not flinch from his friend's gaze. Ignatius Gallagher watched him for a few minutes and then said, "Next."
If ever it occurs, you may bet your bottom dollar there'll be no mooning and spooning about it. I mean to marry money. She'll have a good fat account at the bank, and she won't do for me. Little Chandler shook his head. "Why, man alive," said Ignatius Gallagher vehemently, "do you know what it is? I've only to say the word, and tomorrow I can have the woman and the cash. You don't believe it? Well, I know it. There are hundreds, what I am saying, thousands of rich Germans and Jews rotten with money. They'd only be too glad. You wait a while, my boy, see if I don't play my cards properly. When I go about a thing, I mean business, I tell you. You just wait." He tossed his glass to his mouth, finished his drink, and laughed loudly. Then he looked thoughtfully before him and said in a calmer tone, "But I'm in no hurry. They can wait. I don't fancy tying myself up to one woman, you know." He imitated with his mouth the act of tasting and made a wry face. "Must get a bit stale, I should think," he said. Next, please.
Little Chandler sat in the room off the hall, holding a child in his arms. To save money, they kept no servant, but Annie's young sister Monica came for an hour or so in the morning and an hour or so in the evening to help. But Monica had gone home long ago. It was 9:15. Little Chandler had come home late for tea, and moreover he had forgotten to bring Annie home the parcel of coffee from Bewley's. Of course she was in a bad humour and gave him short answers. She said she would do without any tea, but when it came near the time at which the shop at the corner closed, she decided to go out herself for 1/4 pound of tea and 2 pounds of sugar. She put the sleeping child deftly in his arms and said, "Here, don't waken him." Next, please.
A little lamp with a white china shades stood upon the table, and its light fell over the photograph, which was enclosed in a frame of crumpled horn. It was Annie's photograph. Little Chandler looked at it, pausing at the thin, tight lips. She wore the pale blue summer blouse, which he had brought her home as a present one Saturday. It had cost him 10 and 11 pence, but what an agony of nervousness it had cost him. How he had suffered that day, waiting at the shop door until the shop was empty, standing at the counter and trying to appear at his ease while the girl piled ladies' blouses before him, paying at the desk and forgetting to take up the odd penny of his change, being called back by the cashier, and finally arriving to hide his blushes as he left the shop by examining the parcel to see if it was securely tied. When he brought the blouse home, Annie kissed him and said it was very pretty and stylish. But when she heard the price, she threw the blouse on the table and said it was a regular swindle to charge 10 and 11 pence for that. At first she wanted to take it back, but when she tried it on, she was delighted with it, especially with the make of the sleeves, and kissed him and said he was very good to think of her. Next, please.
He looked coldly into the eyes of the photograph, and they answered coldly. Certainly they were pretty, and the face itself was pretty, but he found something mean in it. Why was it so unconscious and ladylike? The composure of the eyes irritated him. They repelled him and defied him. There was no passion in them, no rapture. He thought of what Gallagher had said about rich Jewesses. Those dark Oriental eyes, he thought, how full they are of passion, of voluptuous longing. Why had he married the eyes in the photograph? He caught himself up at the question and glanced nervously round the room. He found something mean in the pretty furniture which he had bought for his house on the hire system. Annie had chosen it herself, and it reminded him of her. It too was prim and pretty. A dull resentment against his life awoke within him. Could he not escape from this little house? Was it too late for him to try to live bravely like Gallagher? Could he go to London? There was the furniture still to be paid for. If he could only write a book and get it published, that might open the way for him. Next.
A volume of Byron's poems lay before him on the table. He opened it cautiously with his left hand, lest he should awaken the child, and began to read the first poem in the book. Hushed are the winds, and still the evening gloom. Noran, a zephyr wanders through the grove. Whilst I return to view my Margaret's tomb, and scatter flowers on the dust I love. He paused. He felt the rhythm of the verse about him in the room. How melancholy it was. Could he too write like that? Express the melancholy of his soul in verse? There was so many things he wanted to describe. His sensation of a few hours before on Grattan Bridge, for example, if he could get back again into that mood. The child awoke and began to cry. He turned from the page and tried to hush it, but it would not be hushed. He began to rock it to and fro in his arms, but its wailing cry grew keener. He rocked it faster while his eyes began to read the second stanza. Next, please.
Within this narrow cell reclines her clay, that clay where once it was useless. He couldn't read. He couldn't do anything. The wailing of the child pierced the drum of his ear. It was useless, useless. He was a prisoner for life. His arms trembled with anger, and suddenly bending to the child's face, he shouted, "Stop!" The child stopped for an instant, had a spasm of fright, and began to scream. He jumped up from his chair and walked hastily up and down the room with the child in his arms. It began to sob piteously, losing its breath 4 or 5 seconds, and then bursting out anew. The thin walls of the room echoed the sound. He tried to soothe it, but it sobbed more convulsively. He looked at the contracted and quivering face of the child and began to be alarmed. He counted 7 sobs without a break between them and caught the child to his breast in fright. If it died. The door burst open and a young woman ran in, panting. "What is it? What is it?" she cried. Next, please.
The child, hearing its mother's voice, broke out into paroxysm of sobbing. It's nothing, Annie, it's nothing. He began to cry. She flung her parcels on the floor and snatched the child from him. "What have you done to him?" she cried, glaring into his face. Little Chandler sustained for one moment the gaze of her eyes, and his heart closed together as he met the hatred in them. He began to stammer, It's nothing. He began to cry. I couldn't do anything." "What?" Giving no heed to him, she began to walk up and down the room, clasping the child tightly in her arms and murmuring, my little Manny. Was you frightened, love? Now there, love, there now. Lamb of balm, mama's little lamb of the world, there now." Little Chandler felt his cheeks suffused with shame, and he stood back out of the lamplight. He listened while the paroxysm of the child's sobbing grew less and less, and tears of remorse started through his eyes.
Oh,
Hmm.
I think a great part of this story is Joyce himself and his feelings of being trapped. It's in the one sentence especially. If you wanted to succeed, you had to go away. You could do nothing in Dublin. I thought was a very telling sentence, because that was how Joyce felt about Dublin, about Ireland.
Absolutely.
And that's the paralysis that they talk about, it being in each story too.
Mm-hmm. I think we have successfully picked a companion piece to the first story again.
Well, he's trapped.
Mm-hmm.
No escape from this little house. If he could only write a book and get it published.
But it also seems like Gallagher is not as successful as he would pretend.
No.
Hmm.
Yeah, Gallagher's kind of a blowhard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, he might have his name in print, but he's not successful.
And Chandler seems to think that he has it in him to be something more.
Yeah.
And so frustrated. And so he says he was a prisoner for life.
Mhm. He also
To
seems
stand
not
right.
to think well of his spouse. I mean, she was something that he had to do, but like marriage was something he had to do, but
Mhm.
she wasn't his equal. She didn't share what he wanted to do with his life.
No.
Reminds me of the old, golly, who's the comedian on Marx? The Marx brother, who said that he wouldn't want to be a member of any country club that would have him for a member.
Him as a member, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But here too is the repetitive nature of the relationships. Like his wife calls the baby little Chandler,
Yes.
you
Little
know,
man.
little man,
Mhm.
little man. It'll continue.
Yeah, he seems kind of nearly afraid of her, and that's right. Like he's afraid even to read poetry to her, like, let alone maybe write something and read his own writing to her. Like he doesn't even want to take out the poetry books.
Yeah.
Because all the books that he had bought in his bachelor days, but he had never shared them.
Mm-hmm.
a very
Yeah,
sad
one would think that if one if a person was deeply into poetry, they would have gone over that territory before they got married.
That's true.
You know. But he
There seems to be a bit of Nora about her, in other words, like the, you know, buying an expensive blouse, you know, the way like Joyce, when he did have money, like you might buy something expensive, but you did hardly anything to eat, whatever, you know, and Nora, she did like the gifts, but, and this one as well, you know, when she tries it on, she does like it, but like, oh, she price of money that she paid for that. So you can imagine like he's nervous, you know, giving it to her, nervous in the shop even, like, you know, buying a lady's blouse, and then, yeah, so she's not grateful initially, is she? And then she puts it on and goes, well, thank you for your kindness, but not so grateful.
I think it all comes very clear, actually very early in the story, when he goes out and basically completely ignores and doesn't have any interaction or any real attention to the street urchins in the street. And then where he's fascinated by the wealthy people. So he's a man of surfaces, you know, and he doesn't particularly like his own surface, although he spends a lot of time making himself as presentable as possible.
Yeah. He has mixed feelings, I think, about himself. I think he feels he has potential, but at the moment he's not on a par.
Yeah, it feels like he hasn't applied himself to a writing career.
Yeah.
You know, he's compromised himself. I mean, it takes a lot to focus and produce and have the time and space to be creative. And it sounds like he hasn't demanded that and hasn't produced. So he's compromised.
Isn't he a bit like Stephen Dedalus in Ulysses? He's imagining the books that he's going to write with the letters, and he's going to be immortal, and it's going to end up in libraries, and here, you know, he's imagining you know, what the critics or reviewers are going to say about him, you know, so like he wants the glory of it, not necessarily, you know, he's not necessarily writing.
The work.
He wants to write poetry. It's more like, you know, that he wants to be known as a poet, and wants a more Irish looking name. My gosh.
Oh, the name.
Well, I think he is aware of the fact that he better keep all that as just a dream that he can pull out of his dream box to console
Was that
himself.
the name then? A little cloud, like a dream, like if you got your head in the cloud, it's a dream.
Yeah, I don't think he really thinks he has any talent at all. Which is why, you know, he keeps on shrinking himself. You know,
He would never be popular. He saw that.
And it says also, I think, in the beginning that he wasn't actually particularly small. It wasn't like he was physically small, but that somehow his behavior, you know, made him seem quite small.
Because he was fragile. His hands were white and small. His frame was fragile. His voice was quiet.
And wasn't it curious through the whole story? He's referred to as Little Chandler, and Gallagher is Ignatius Gallagher. Ignatius has a whole name, you know, the full name.
Do you like the description of Paris and London and the spiciness? What's the line about the spicy? Is it Paris, isn't it? And the cocotte, the name for it. Well, a cocotte is it's a type of pot, but it's also another name for a prostitute.
Oh, okay.
Funny, I bought one of the pots that says Cocot on the lid, actually. And so I was having a little Joycean smile to myself when I bought it at a second-hand shop.
Well, it's very interesting that they would have all that, and yet, you know, as we know from other writings of Joyce, that actually Dublin was a pretty notorious place with Nighttown and all that. And actually, London at that time, although it spent a certain amount of trouble denying the fact, London was pretty outrageously nasty place to be for immorality and all kinds of carousing.
I'm looking at Tyndall, who says, the pathetic story of little Chandler and Gallagher is another approach to the affairs of Shem and Sean, who appear in Finnegan's Wake. But this portrait of the artist has sardonic reference to what Joyce might have become if confirmed by a parallel passage in the 3rd chapter of Ulysses, where Stephen, another frustrated artist, also imagines review of books he has not written. I, very like a whale, concludes his fantasy. This whale, of course, the little cloud of Polonius, by whose aid Stephen becomes another little Chandler. All three are under little clouds. So I thought that was interesting.
Well, I think it's interesting what you said before in the beginning of that, with that this is an early version of Shem and Sean.
Yeah.
Although I'm, you know, that's a little strained in the sense that Shem actually goes on to do things, as does Joyce. I mean, the Joyce in Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man actually uses that dream to leave his situation and to go out in the world and actually do it. But certainly, I end with no hope for little Chandler.
No, it's
Yeah.
a sad,
Never
a
going
sad-
any further
Yeah.
than where he is.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a sad story.
Yeah, sad. He married too young.
The little cloud. So I said earlier about the little cloud being the dream, but then the cloud of the cloud of despair as well. And so a little cloud can be positive or negative. A cloud hanging over you.
Right. Well, you remember in Ulysses that after Bloom goes to the butcher's shop and purchases the pork kidney, and he's on his way back, and the cloud goes in front of the sun, and Bloom himself becomes extremely negative. Quickly, that cloud sends him into a depressed state, which he only breaks out of by imagining Molly back at home, and then he breaks out of that cloud. So, well, great.
Can I ask a question? I was just looking up at the back, just the line about the women. Their faces were powdered, and they caught up their dresses when they touched earth. Again, the women holding up their dresses in Ulysses too. But when they touched earth, like alarmed Atalantis. So I'd never heard of an Atalanta, but from Greek mythology, Atalanta was an athlete who would marry only a man who could beat her in a race.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I think that's a sign of how little Chandler reveres. Actually, he's a man of surfaces, and he reveres those upper classes.
Yeah.
As much as he despises, the street urchins. You know what? I'm going to have to go. I can either, if you want to continue talking, I can assign Ann Doak and make her host, but a time schedule.
I
Yeah.
need to go too.
Yeah, I need to go too.
Can I ask, why was I late? What time did you start?
Usual time.
Depends where you are.
I'm in Montana right now, so I came in at noon and you were already reading. So where did I go wrong?
The time difference
Must be the
Has to be-
time difference, Katrina, because we started at the usual time. Did you change your clocks? Did you change the
Yeah,
clock?
no, it would be, so what, I'm sorry to belabor this, but did you, what time is it? Let's say where you are, Duncan, you're in Texas, but, and
Right
I'm,
now, it is 2:38.
okay, and I'm at 12:38. Okay, well, I'll have to figure out what I did, because
Perhaps Montana is on
it's mountain time. It's
on
Mountain Time.
Pacific time. Could it be on Pacific time?
No, it's an hour, later. So
I don't know what to say, Katrina. Perhaps
don't
you
either.
fell into a special time warp.
that's what it feels like, because I can't figure it
Unique
out.
to your exact location. Because I think the rest of us are pretty much in agreement.
Yeah,
Started
clearly.
at the correct time, the usual time, I
okay.
should say.
So on Thursday, I'll try to get it right by then. I don't know what, it's weird. I'll figure it out.
Okay, well, if you joined us at 12 o'clock on your clock now, if
Yes,
you don't change that clock between now and Thursday, try joining us at 11 o'clock.
That sounds like a good rule.
because
That
that's what I
sounds-
did. Well, that's what I did from California. It was
I
always
know.
11, so here now it's 12.
Yeah, well, that's why I say you may be in a special Katrina time warp.
I think I must be. Well, thanks. Anyway,
Okay.
good to be
All right.
back.
Yeah, and we hope you will join us at that
Absolutely.
time next time.
What are y'all doing for Bloomsday? Anything?
Yeah.
I'm going to be Jerry and I are doing this little thing. And
Mhm.
I'm just going to make a general presentation on these are online tools that I use when reading
Mhm.
Ulysses. And there's nothing special about them, but they're a good place to start. And
Okay.
they're free. So that's what I'm doing. And then I don't know if you know Roy Benjamin. He teaches at City College, New York, I think. Teaches literature. And
Okay.
he just wrote a book called Breaking the Bounds, Beating the Boundaries. And he joins Jerry and some other people on a regular basis, and he's going to make some sort of presentation.
Good.
And then I may join a thing or two.
I'm in Orlando, so I didn't actually get the day off. I should have put in for holidays, but anyway, I kind of thought I might be off anyway. But yeah, so not much I can do in Orlando. If I dress up, they'll think I'm Mary Poppins. So
Are you going to be in Orlando?
in Orlando, yeah. But I am going to. There's a talk by Professor Sam Sloat in the James Joyce Centre on Wednesday, so I'm going to go to that. So he's talking about the three places, Trieste, Zurich, and Paris. So yeah, where Richards wrote Ulysses. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
In the past, we've had a site, a bar of some sort to go to read
Mhm.
from Ulysses. But our favorite bar is still under reconstruction, so we're all
Oh,
waiting.
We're waiting
Soon.
we're
It's
waiting
over.
for Bill.
Yeah,
And I
Waiting for
made you the
Bill.
host. You all can carry on as long as you like, but my
Thanks.
clock is.
Okay.
sorry, I
Thanks.
extended that.
I gotta go too.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye.
Bye,
Bye, everyone.
So Anne, you're going to,